The first hammer strike echoed through the valley at dawn. It wasn't a normal sound, not the creak of pines swaying, or the rumble of wagons, or even the distant thump of axes against trees. No, this had a sharper, stranger rhythm, a rhythm that caught the attention of every settler within earshot. Is she building up there? She's lost it. From the road below, the widow Albright could be seen, her silhouette small against the rising light, as she stood atop the old barn that had been left to her when her husband died 3 winters ago. But now the wood was fresh again, scaffolding rising like ribs around the roof, and atop it all, a frame, a house frame. She wasn't just fixing the barn, she was building her home on top of it. Men spat into the dust and shook their heads. She'll fall through the floor before the snow even comes. That widow's making a fool of herself. But she kept building. Ellen Albright had been alone since 1862. Her husband, Nathaniel, was a rancher, quiet, patient, and stubborn in the way most good men are. When the influenza took him, he left behind their son, Samuel, and the barn they'd raised together. The boy didn't last long either. 2 years later, at just 15, he slipped on river ice, broke his neck. After that, Ellen withdrew. She turned down every offer to remarry, wouldn't move into town, wouldn't leave the property, but she never left the barn, slept inside it, worked by lantern light. People said she spoke to herself, to Nathaniel maybe, or to the boy. Still, she wasn't mad. She was just done waiting for something to make sense again. Then, in September of '66, she started gathering lumber, nails, cement from the crossing, rafters, windows, real glass, the kind you didn't see out here unless a man had come from money. But Ellen hadn't come from money. She came from grit. She's building a cabin on the barn roof, the settlers said. Wind'll take it right off. Damn woman's got too much pride. They laughed as they rode past, stared up as they hauled firewood to their root cellars. A few offered to help, not kindly, but the way a man offers to fix something he thinks is broken. She said no. Her neighbors, Miller, across the creek, and the Crowleys down the trail, watched with a mix of confusion and concern. The Crowleys had 6 mouths to feed, and they couldn't afford to think too long about a woman they thought might not make it through the season. But old Miller? He watched her every day from his porch with a tin mug and something hotter than coffee in his hand. Foolish or brave, he muttered to no one. We'll find out come snow. By mid-October, the structure was nearly complete. And no, it wasn't some fantasy tower. It was plain, practical. Sturdy walls, sealed seams, a heavy sloped roof angled to dump snow to either side. She'd built the cabin frame directly on top of a reinforced barn attic, adding cross beams and braces thicker than most folks put in their homes. There were trapdoors, pulleys, and, most bizarre of all, what looked like a stovepipe that ran up through the barn into the cabin. Insane, Miller said again. She's heating the top, not the animals? The thing was, Ellen didn't tell anyone her plan. She never explained. She just worked, measured twice, hammered once, hauled logs with a mule so old it looked half frozen already. But behind her, silence was a calculation. She'd watched her neighbors suffer every winter, watched roofs collapse under the weight of snowpack, watched fires go out, chimneys clog, and families freeze while trying to cook over embers, watched as ice crept in from the floorboards and never left until April. Ellen had buried a husband and a son to cold. She wasn't planning on joining them. The first frost came early that year. November bit down like a wolf, wind screaming through the canyons before the leaves had even finished turning. The valley froze overnight. Chickens stopped laying. Wells needed breaking just to draw a bucket. And already the younger cabins, those with rushed chinking or shallow hearths, were struggling to hold warmth. By then, so the cabin on a barn looked nearly finished. Not pretty, but fortified. Smoke curled from its stovepipe. Lamps flickered behind the thick glass windows. And from the hillside road, a few settlers even began to wonder, maybe she's not crazy. But they'd laugh again, quick to cover it. Sure, but wait until the real snow comes. It came on a Wednesday. By Friday, the whole valley was buried. The Crowley's roof bowed by Saturday. The miller's door froze shut from the inside. And by Sunday, folks were walking house to house, asking for spare wood, for kerosene, for help. Miller hadn't seen smoke from the Crowleys in hours. He trudged through waist-deep snow to check, found them wrapped in quilts, shivering, the baby with blue lips. Then someone said, "What about the widow's place? She must have frozen by now," except she hadn't. From the road, they saw the light, bright, steady, smoke, rich and thick, rising from the pipe. And as they crested the hill, trudging like ghosts through the drifts, the door of the upper cabin creaked open. There stood Ellen, rosy cheeks, a scarf around her neck, and warm air rolling out behind her like a bakery in July. She blinked, looked down at them. "Well," she said, "you finally come to mock me again?" Miller shook his head, eyes wide. "No, ma'am," he said, lifting his hat. "I reckon we came to apologize." Ellen Albright didn't open her door wide, not at first. She simply looked out at the cluster of shivering men and women blinking at her like they'd seen a ghost. Some had icicles hanging from their scarves. One of the Crowley boys was crying, softly, his face blotchy and red. Her eyes scanned the group. Mine then landed on old Miller. He looked half dead, a bruised cheek, and his coat stiff with ice. "I told you this winter would be bad," she said. Miller nodded. "Didn't think you'd be the one best prepared." Ellen didn't smile. She stepped back and held the door open. "Don't track snow across the floor," she said. "And for God's sake, don't touch the stove." They entered in silence. The inside of the cabin was nothing short of astonishing. Warmth struck them like a wave. Not stifling, not smoky, but comfortable, like a midsummer dusk. Every wall had been insulated, rugs layered over floors, thick curtains drawn, but not tightly, enough to let light pass through. The stove glowed orange behind its iron grating, a kettle already steaming atop it. Above them, thick beams supported the ceiling. The room had 2 beds pushed to opposite corners and a long table in the center, flanked by mismatched chairs. One end of the room had dried herbs and jars neatly stacked on wooden shelves. The other had a workbench and tools, measured, arranged, sharpened. A rifle sat on a wall hook. "What in God's name?" someone whispered. "Looks like a trading post." "No," Ellen said simply. "Looks like a place I don't plan to freeze to death in." No one laughed. That night, she let them stay. All of them. 6 Crowleys, Miller, a boy from the river named Nathan, and 2 others who'd made it through the snow from the southern trail. She rationed the stew carefully, gave them bread she'd baked the week before, still soft inside. The kettle never left the stove. Later, once the younger kids were asleep under quilts, Miller sat across from Ellen at the table, watching her mend a glove with a needle and coarse thread. "Why'd you do it like this?" he finally asked. "Like what?" "Build this place up here." Ellen didn't look up. "Why do you think?" Miller took a long moment. "You didn't just want to be warm?" "No," she said. "I wanted to be above it." "Above what?" She looked up now, not angry, not quite. "Everything that buries people. Cold, flood, fire, grief. The land takes and takes. I lost my whole family because I was always reacting too late." She tied off the thread with a hard pull. "This time, I built before the storm." It didn't take long for word to spread. By the end of the week, families were trudging up the hill daily. Not for shelter necessarily. Ellen didn't have room for all of them, but for warmth, for water, for a place to dry soaked boots. One neighbor even brought his horse, half-starved and shaking, and Ellen let him tie it beneath the barn, where the hay was still dry and the barn's base, warmed from the stove above, had kept the worst of the ice from forming. That was when people started realizing the genius of her design. The stove on the second floor, in the cabin, ran through a pipe that also heated the barn below. Not enough to make it cozy, but enough to keep livestock from freezing. There were vents she could open and close, small ones cut with care, allowing warmth to pass downward when needed. The roof was pitched steep enough that snow couldn't accumulate. The base of the cabin, its stilts and the barn roof, had been reinforced so thoroughly it might have held the weight of a wagon. No other structure in the valley had held up as well, not a one, and the settlers knew it. By the end of December, Ellen Albright, the same widow they'd whispered about, pitied, mocked, was now spoken of differently. Not with reverence, exactly, but with caution. The kind of respect people reserve for someone who might know something you don't. "Did you hear she predicted the snowfall?" "She didn't predict it," someone else would answer. "She just built like it was coming, whether or not it did." And that changed things. Men who once rode past laughing were now showing up with their hats in their hands, asking how she'd built her crossbeams, how she sealed the windows. Women who once whispered that she was touched now asked for her bread recipes, for her tricks on food preservation. She never gloated. She never raised her voice or told them they were fools, though she would have had the right. Instead, she told them what she knew, plainly and clearly, and always ended with, "But I won't build it for you." That part mattered. The thaw didn't come until March. By then, something had shifted in the valley, not just in temperature, but in tone. People were speaking differently, checking on each other more, sharing more. And in no small part, it had to do with what had happened on that hill. The place they once called a widow's folly, now being quietly called Albright's Hold by those who'd taken shelter there. A few even started building cabins of their own, elevated, stilted, not quite mimicking Ellen's barn-top design, but certainly inspired by it. The valley's layout was changing, and no one could deny whose hand had set that in motion. But Ellen didn't care about titles or credit. Once the others left and the land began to warm, she went right back to work. She repaired what little damage had been done. She cut new wood, replanted, took in a stray hound that refused to leave her porch. Still, some nights, she sat out by the trapdoor leading down to the barn, a blanket on her knees, looking out over the valley, watching. Miller came by now and then. He didn't bring whiskey anymore, just quiet stories and the occasional bundle of jerky or pipe tobacco. "You know," he said once, "you could be mayor of this valley if you wanted." Ellen smiled. "Rare. Why would I want to be mayor of people who nearly let me die alone?" Miller chuckled. "Fair. But," she added, "I don't mind teaching them, so long as they listen." And they did listen now. They listened when she warned that early spring melts could cause a flood. They listened when she said to reinforce their floors with stone. They listened when she told them to rotate their food stores and bury smoked meats deep to avoid spoilage. The valley, for all its pride, had come to respect the one they'd once ignored. But Ellen Albright didn't care about that either. She wasn't building for recognition, she was building for resilience. And the next time a storm came, they'd remember that. They'd remember the widow on the hill, the one they all mocked, until the wind howled and the fires went out, and she was the only one left with light in her windows. By late spring, the valley had bloomed, but it was not the same valley. The flood came, just like Ellen said it would. A warm snap hit hard after the thaw, and the creek turned violent. It churned through Miller's pasture and bit off a corner of the Crowleys' new lean-to. No one was hurt, but if not for the trenches Ellen had advised them to dig, deep and arched, fed downhill, the damage could have taken homes. That day, after the water receded, Ellen stood at the edge of her elevated cabin and watched the muddy rivulets carving through the brush. She didn't smile, but she didn't look surprised either. People had stopped asking if she was doing all right. That's what they'd used to say in the early days, back when she was just the widow talking to her goats and stacking bricks where no one thought bricks should be. The tone back then had been condescending, not cruel, but indulgent. Now they asked different questions. What do you make of this wind lately, Ellen? Think this dry spell'll last? Got any tricks for storing apples without bruising them?" And to each one she gave an answer, if she had one. If she didn't, she said so. But they listened just the same. She was no longer a curiosity, no longer a lesson. She was an anchor. One afternoon in June, a stranger rode into the valley. He was young, maybe 30, and clean, in that way that suggested either money or ambition. He wore a coat too fine for the dust and boots that looked like they'd been oiled every night of their life. He introduced himself as Charles Hurst, a land surveyor sent by the county, said he was mapping holdings for future improvements. In truth, he was sniffing for purchase, someone looking to trade land rights, sign mineral deeds, lease lumber. So most settlers gave him nothing but stiff handshakes and vague answers. But he made his way up the hill to Ellen's place like all the others eventually did. She was outside sharpening an axe. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat. "Beautiful view you've got." Ellen didn't look up. "The view don't make the winters shorter." He smiled, stepped forward. "Still, strategic location. I imagine it holds value, maybe more than you realize. Is that so? Elevation, runoff control, potential water rights. You've essentially created a homestead design that could be replicated elsewhere. If you were interested in selling or even licensing the idea, there are investors." "I'm not interested." The words cut him off flat. Charles blinked. "Beg pardon?" She finally looked up. The axe gleamed. "I didn't build this place to sell. I built it to survive." "I understand I do, but you could help others." "I am helping others. Every time they ask, I show them how I did it, and they build it themselves. No licenses, no blueprints, just their hands and their will." Charles shifted, suddenly unsure. "Well, if you change your mind, I won't." He left 10 minutes later, didn't even stay for water. That summer, Ellen taught 2 families how to build root cellars insulated with crushed limestone. She helped a teenager rework her family's chimney so it wouldn't backdraft in the wind. And when a rattlesnake took up residence in a neighbor's corn bin, it was Ellen who dug it out with a pitchfork and a calm hand, wrapped in her leather coat like a medieval knight. "Don't get brave with snakes," she said, tossing the dead thing into the brush. "They don't respect brave. They respect steel and stillness." A week later, the same boy who'd mocked her roof 3 years back was overheard telling someone, "I'd trust the widow in a war." But not everyone liked the change. Some of the older settlers, the ones who'd been there since before Ellen arrived, grumbled about how folks talked about her like she was Moses. One in particular, Everett Bain, took issue with how much time his son was spending up at the cabin. "Don't need no woman filling your head with fears and superstitions," Everett spat one morning. "You don't need a fortress if you live right." But that fall, when the forest west of the valley caught fire from a lightning storm and a wall of smoke rolled in fast, it was Ellen's elevation that saved half the livestock in the southern basin. She opened the barn, took in goats, chickens, even a pair of oxen. The fire didn't reach them, but the smoke did. She had vents ready, charcoal filters she'd rigged from old whiskey barrels, rags soaked in vinegar. It wasn't comfortable, but it was survivable. No one else had been ready. After that, Everett Bain didn't say much, and if he did, it was never around Ellen. The following winter was mild, almost lazy compared to the one before, but no one took it for granted. If anything, they were more diligent, more watchful. They had Ellen's voice in their heads now. Every structure built that year had steeper roofs, wider eaves, chimneys built in the Albright style, triple sealed with stone caps and wind flares. Someone even carved her name, discreetly, into the corner beam of the schoolhouse next to the date of completion. She never knew who. One night, as snow began to dust the fields again, Ellen sat by her stove, sewing a tear in her coat. A knock came, not frantic, not desperate, just firm. She opened the door and found a young girl there, no more than 10. The child's cheeks were red, but her eyes were clear. "You're the lady who built the barn house," the girl said. "I am. My mama said if I want to learn to build like that, I ought to ask you before my hands get too soft." Ellen stepped aside. "Come in then. You can help me split kindling, but if you drop the hatchet, I take it back." "Yes, ma'am," the girl said, beaming. Ellen had never tried to lead, never wanted to. But leadership doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't ride in on a horse or stand on a podium. Sometimes it's just being ready when no one else is. Sometimes it's building the thing everyone else is too proud to imagine they'll ever need. And so when the Valley would speak of her in later years, long after she passed, it wasn't in myths or ballads. It was in floor plans, in hearths that stayed lit through January, in homes where children grew up never knowing the bite of cold that once took families whole. And it was said that when storms came, even decades later, folks would glance up at that hill, at the cabin on the barn, and feel steadier for it. Because someone once had been mocked for doing the unthinkable, and then she'd done it anyway. The girl's name was Clara Bain. Yes, Bain, as in Everett Bain's youngest daughter. And yes, that Everett Bain, the man who had once called Ellen Albright a lunatic in front of half the settlement, sneering at her barn-top home like it were the world's largest bird perch. That Everett Bain, who had once stood on the church steps and said, "You can't build yourself out of grief." He never mentioned that when Clara started spending afternoons at Ellen's place. Didn't forbid her either. Clara had strong hands for her age. Ellen tested her early, had her split pine, sweep ash, carry water up the ladder when the pulley jammed, never coddled, never explained a second time. If the girl asked questions, Ellen answered, but she never slowed for her. That was the way she'd learned. You survived by keeping up. The girl did, week after week, and with her came others. Sometimes another child, sometimes a teenager, sometimes one of the younger men, sheepish, pretending he was there to check on the stove flue, while he snuck glances at the joinery Ellen had used to brace the west beam. By winter, she had a rhythm going. Not a classroom, exactly, but something more honest. She didn't preach, she demonstrated. Let people watch as she dried herbs, lined barrels with beeswax, and trapped heat with linen pouches filled with ash. People had started calling her visits, going up to school. She didn't correct them. Then came the windstorm. Not snow, not flood, not fire. This was different. In early January, an unnatural heat swept through the canyon one afternoon. A warm wind from the south. The snow melted too fast, and with it came gusts strong enough to shake rafters. Trees fell, roofs peeled like onions. And down in the valley, the new schoolhouse, the one Ellen had inspired, with her triple-sealed design, cracked straight through the west wall. No one died, but it was close. A rafter missed Clara's older brother by inches. Ellen was down the hill before the dust settled. Inside the ruined schoolhouse, Miller and Everett Bain were already hauling out desks. Two younger men tried stabilizing the beams with fence posts. Kids huddled in shawls, coughing from dust. Ellen stepped in, quiet but direct. "You have to clear out. This frame's gone." "We can brace it," said one man. "Not in time." "You don't know that." She didn't argue. She walked to the beam, knelt, and pulled at the seam with a gloved hand. It shifted. The whole west side groaned. "Get the children out, now!" They moved. She and Miller took the last two by the arms, Clara and the Bain boy, and the moment they were free of the porch, the wall collapsed inward like a kicked anthill. Wood splinters exploded. Dust poured from the cracks. Silence followed. Then Miller turned to Ellen. "You ever consider witchcraft?" Ellen ignored him, eyes scanning the horizon. "This wind isn't stopping. We need shelter by nightfall." That night, 17 people slept in the barn below her cabin. Not just the animals this time, families. Ellen opened the back stalls, laid blankets, started up a second iron stove she'd never before needed. The warmth from the cabin above trickled down just enough to keep the chill at bay. Clara sat at the trapdoor, watching the kettle steam above. "You think the wind's going to tear the whole valley apart?" she asked. Ellen didn't answer right away. "I think it's testing us." Clara frowned. "Testing what? Whether we've learned?" The storm lasted 3 more days. When it passed, half the cabins in the lower basin had taken damage. Roofs gone, doors blown clean off their hinges. One man's entire food store, gone with the wind, sacks scattered like paper through the trees. But the barn cabin stood untouched. Not a window cracked, not a beam shifted. Someone called it the lighthouse, the one visible warm light when the valley turned black. And from that point forward, people stopped saying Albright's Hold with irony. They said it like they meant it, like a fortress. In the spring, Ellen planted again. Clara helped. So did others. They didn't ask. They just came. A row of new trees went up along the path. Windbreaks to stop erosion. A trench dug by volunteers to divert water from the slope. Even Everett Bain sent nails and lumber, dropped off with no note. The cabin no longer belonged to Ellen alone. It belonged to the valley. But Ellen knew something no one else would say out loud yet. These storms, the fire, the snow, the wind, they weren't flukes, they were patterns. She'd seen it in the creek's pulse, in the way the snow packed denser, melted faster. The soil was shifting, the seasons swinging harder every year. The valley wouldn't get easier, and the people, they'd survive, but not if they clung to what used to be. That summer, Ellen wrote something rare, a letter, not to a person, to the settlement council. It had never met formally, never even called itself that, but she wrote it anyway, a proposal. In it she suggested a central storehouse, modeled after her barn, elevated, vented, triple-chimneyed. A design she offered freely. She laid out the lumber needed, the beams, the insulation. She offered to show them how to build it, brick by brick, nail by nail, but only if the community built it together. At the fall meeting, when the council gathered around the long table in the church basement, her letter was read aloud. There was some silence after, then murmurs, doubts, logistics. But then Miller spoke. "I say we build it," he said, rising to his feet, "because next time a storm hits and one of us runs out of food or water or firewood, I'd rather there be a place ready to help. Not a grave to dig." It passed unanimously. Construction began before the frost, and every beam, every nail, someone else lifted it. Not Ellen. She taught, she pointed, she guided, but she didn't touch a single log herself. Clara did. So did her brother. So did a boy who'd nearly lost his fingers to frostbite in the storm 2 winters prior. That building still stands. Some say it's just a storehouse. Others call it the second cabin. But those who were there, they know. They know it was the moment Ellen Albright stepped back and let the valley carry what she had once carried alone. The first frost of that 5th winter came earlier than any in memory. No warning, no transition. One evening it was crisp, the kind of late autumn chill that encouraged soup and long stories. And by morning, the ground was iron, and the water buckets had shattered overnight like brittle glass. But the valley didn't panic. They lit fires early, covered windows, checked vents and trapdoors. They had insulation now. They had stores. They had plans. Not everyone had a cabin like Ellen's, but everyone had learned from it, and more importantly, they'd begun learning from one another. It was, in quiet ways, the first winter they entered with something like confidence. That confidence had a name, and even if it wasn't spoken aloud often, everyone knew where it began. Ellen herself had grown slower, not weak. No, she still chopped kindling, still hauled pails from the well with those same stubborn arms. But the climb up the ladder to her attic trapdoor, it took longer. The stove, once lit before first light, now waited until just after dawn. Her eyes lingered more at the edges of letters when she read. She noticed it most in her stitching. The thread didn't move the same through her fingers anymore. Her hands had become tools, strong but imprecise. Not clumsy, just tired. It didn't frighten her. She had not built her life around the illusion of permanence. She had built it to outlast her. Clara came every Sunday, without fail. No matter the weather, the walk, or the chores left behind, the girl, now nearly 17, arrived with the same determined knock. Sometimes she brought bread, sometimes news, sometimes a fresh question about a rafter pattern or vent placement. And every time, Ellen sat at the table, poured tea, and gave her what she had. One evening, as the wind howled through the trees outside, Clara asked the thing that had been building all season. "What happens when you're gone?" Ellen looked up, no shock in her eyes. "You mean the cabin?" Clara nodded. Ellen leaned back in her chair. "It'll stand." "That's not what I meant." Ellen waited. "I mean this, the way you taught us, the way we watch the weather now. The storehouse. The idea that we don't have to live waiting for something to take everything." Ellen's fingers rested against her teacup, absorbing the warmth. "You think it'll vanish just because I do?" "I don't know." Ellen looked out the window. Snow was beginning to fall, slow and silent. "You ever been in a blizzard?" Clara gave a soft laugh. "3 now, thanks to you. You remember what it's like in the middle of one? You can't see your hand. You can't tell the road from the ditch. And the wind, it doesn't howl. It screams, like it wants to pull your name out of your mouth and carry it off." Clara nodded slowly. "Now," Ellen said, "imagine you see a light in the distance. Just a flicker. Someone's window. Would you walk toward it?" "Of course. Even if the storm told you not to?" Clara didn't answer at first. Yes, she finally said. That's what this place is, Ellen said softly. That's what the cabin is. That's what you become. A light. A reason someone else keeps walking. She met Clara's eyes. So long as you keep that lit, even if it's just for one other person, I haven't gone anywhere. In February, Ellen stopped coming down from the cabin. Not because she was ill, not at first. She still answered the door, still waved from the top landing, but she no longer walked to the storehouse, didn't attend the monthly gatherings, didn't check on the trench lines or the chimney stones. Clara brought her food. Miller dropped off firewood. One of the Crowley boys started checking the pulleys under the barn to make sure the grain hoists didn't freeze. And then, one cold morning, the smoke didn't rise from the chimney. Miller found her in her bed, quilt drawn up to her chin, eyes closed as if she'd simply blinked for too long. No sign of struggle. The fire was out, but the embers still warm. A half-read book lay open on the table. The teapot had gone cold. She hadn't suffered. She hadn't called out. She'd just let go, as she had lived, with intention. They held the service in the barn, not because there wasn't room elsewhere, but because it felt right. People filled every inch, standing in the stalls, along the loft, near the old beams she'd reinforced herself. Someone brought her tools and laid them on the table like relics. Her coat hung near the stove. Miller spoke first. He didn't talk long. She taught us to build, he said, and she taught us to stop pretending the storms weren't coming. There were no hymns, no sermons. Just a silence so thick it felt like another kind of snow, one that blanketed the room with a weight too big for words. In the spring, they built her a marker, not a grave. Ellen had left instructions to be buried beneath her cabin, near the back support post where her husband's initials had once been carved. But above it they built a bench, a tall one, high-backed and broad, made from the same kind of reinforced cedar she'd once hauled up the ridge alone. On the back, burned into the wood, were 5 simple words. She built before the storm, and life went on. The valley grew, not fast, not in some explosive gold rush way, but it expanded. 2 more barns were built, using her design. A new family arrived from the east and was shocked to find that nearly every home had roof angles that mirrored one woman's blueprints. No one told them to follow Ellen's methods. They just did, because it worked, because it lasted, because it honored her memory without needing to say her name every hour. Years passed. Clara grew into herself, tall, straight-backed, with a way of speaking that held weight. She took over guiding the new families, taught them to read the snowpack, showed them how to brace beams. She didn't call it teaching, she just did it. And one day a little boy asked her, "Who taught you all this?" She smiled and pointed to the hill. Someone who listened to the land when no one else did. The storms never stopped coming. Some winters were kind, others tore trees from their roots, but never again did the valley fall into chaos. Never again did it face the cold with nothing but prayers and luck, because someone, a widow, or once mocked, had shown them how to prepare, not just with tools, but with courage, with clarity, and with conviction that the worst thing you can do is wait until it's already too late. And so her cabin still stands, maybe not untouched. The beams have been replaced, the shingles repaired, but the soul of it, the shape of the thing, remains, high above the earth, firm against the wind, a reminder carved in wood that there is wisdom in building high, there is strength in preparing early, and there is honor in being the one to light the first fire when everyone else is still waiting for the sun to rise.